This video considers an especially important and interesting set of economic questions, which are related to how we can best provide for the poor. Now, look, since the beginning of time, all societies have had poor people, and all societies have had to figure out how to make provisions for the poor. This continues into our present day, of course, and a lot of the discussion we're going to have in this lecture is relevant for modern debates over welfare. We're going to continue, for example, some gigantic questions like, how do you figure out who is really poor so that you can allocate benefits in the most efficient way? And also, how can you provide a benefit that is good for the poor and not too inconvenient, but that also doesn't weaken incentives for work? We're going to discuss a set of common problems and common solutions, especially focusing on the British case, which has proved to be a model for so many others. I want to start by just framing this question by telling you a little bit about what's going on in the European continent. On the continent, poor provision was arranged by a variety of organizations, not necessarily by governments, starting with religious institutions. So on the Catholic Church on the continent was very strong and provided a lot of poor relief. One big debate in this subject is whether the Protestant Reformation actually might have weakened provisions for the poor by weakening the power of the Catholic Church. This is not clear. It's also not clear how well the Church did in actually making provisions for the poor. Furthermore, on the European continent, agriculture was still run under the institution of serfdom, which by and large was not a good deal for the serfs, but did have one upside, which is that as part of the rules, landlords were actually not legally permitted to allow their serfs to starve. We're going to discuss more about serfdom later, but that's one way that there was private provision for the poor on the European continent. Now, I start by talking about Europe because it's kind of an interesting case because in places outside of Europe, one could rely on rich kinship networks, so families, to make sure that less fortunate members of society were provided for. But Europe is different because Europe has very weak kinship networks, so other kinds of institutions have to fill in. We're going to begin our discussion of this topic by outlining what was called the English Old Poor Law. This dates all the way back to the 16th century and was instituted by Elizabeth I, and it is in fact sometimes known as Elizabeth's Statute. So we can think of this as kind of like a early government effort to institute poor relief, and it has some rather peculiar qualities. So first, as a background to this law, this was instituted at a time when there was this perception that there were poor people roaming the countryside starving. And this was portrayed, as this like big nuisance. So this law is about social control. The law says that no one in England has the right to starve. So think about that carefully, right? This is about controlling the poor in addition to providing for the poor. And it's organized in a really interesting way. So the Old English Poor Law, Elizabeth's Statute, was administered at the level of the parish. The parish is the smallest, lowest level of civic organization in England in this period. There's about 16,000 of these in England and Wales. So these are super, super, super tiny little local governments. And what they would do is these parishes had the right to collect a tax in order to make provisions for the poor. But a lot of the details are up to the parish. And if the parish doesn't do a good job, the poor can actually sue the parish to get their correct poor provision. So what the parish could do is they could institute a tax on land and buildings, which implies that ultimately the incidence of this tax is going to fall on landlords. Because even if farmers are actually paying the tax, the farmers are going to pass that expense onto the landlords in the form of lower rents because land is relatively inelastic. What's interesting is the way that this played out is about half of these taxes ended up being spent on the people that you might have expected in a poor law, the old, the disabled, widows. But 50% of the outlays were for able-bodied men, okay, men who might otherwise be working. So that's interesting. The poor law at the parish level was administered by a body called a vestry that was elected. And interestingly, to a large degree, these vestries ended up being controlled by the landlords. So these are the folks who held the tax incidents. They have the power to decide what the taxes are going to be, what amounts they're going to be, and also who gets relief and how much relief they're going to get. The old poor law could provide two different kinds of relief: outdoor relief and indoor relief. These are a little confusing, so let me go over what these terms mean. Outdoor relief is kind of what you, I think, would want if you were a poor person under this regime. Under outdoor relief, you get to continue to live at home and receive some kind of support. And most of the old poor law takes the form of outdoor relief. Indoor relief is less pleasant. Under indoor relief, you're sent to some kind of institution, namely a workhouse. This will be the centerpiece of what's called the new poor law that's coming later, but there's not too much of this going on under the old poor law. Now, a workhouse is a place you go to live. They will provide housing and food to you, but they will make you do tasks, and they're often terrible, menial, repetitive tasks, and it's kind of meant as punishment, okay? It's kind of meant to be like, see, this isn't fun, go do something else. It's used as a threat often to the poor. Now, in terms of the kinds of outdoor relief that the poor law could provide, it could take on many forms. The poor law could provide rent, food, just literally pay cash. It could subsidize any work that you do. So if you do some work, they'll top up your wages to make sure that you're at a subsistence level. The wage subsidies are particularly interesting. So one potential economic effect of a wage subsidy is a distortion in the labor market. If employers know that wage subsidies will come to their workers, that might mean that the employer can pay a little less. The employer doesn't have to worry anymore about getting to a subsistence level in order to ensure high quality work. Sadly, I think there's been some expose showing that like McDonald's does this today, right? That they know that you can get food stamps, they encourage you to get food stamps, and they don't pay as much as they otherwise would. Another way that this could happen is they might be paying farmers to sort of take on extra folks and do some kind of make work with them. Wage subsidies are still around today. They're a big cornerstone of modern welfare systems in the United States, for example. I'll mention a few other kind of specific phenomena that emerged here. One is called the roundsman system. So this is kind of diggers and fillers, as we used to say. So under the roundsman system, the parishes would actually pay employers to take on additional people. So that's a term I'd like you to know. And I also want to highlight that often as you're reading, you'll come across something called the Speenhamland system. And this is a very formalized wage subsidy system where they actually have essentially an equation for how much wage subsidy to give you, which was based on both family size and the going price of bread. So this is an interesting and early sophisticated wage subsidy system. And just to give you some idea where the heck Speenhamland is almost like a mirror image of the counties that we talked about that had the Industrial Revolution, okay? This is all the rest. It's the rural southern counties, which would have encountered a lot of poverty as the Industrial Revolution was ongoing. Now, as interesting background, the poor law was instituted simultaneously with some of the earlier changes in agriculture that we discussed, in particular, enclosure. So we remember that we talked about how enclosure had winners and losers. And some of the losers under enclosure would have been the poorer farmers who would have lost their commons rights. Now, there were actually enclosure riots. There were outbreaks of protest when enclosure happened, but there was not an outright revolution in England, even though such folks were deprived of rights and opportunities to make a living. Well, one reason that there may not have been a complete revolt is that the poor law kind of created a basement for how bad things could get for the poor. The poor did not starve even if they lost their commons rights. Now, on the continent, there was no instituted formal poor law like this. And some people think that that may have made enclosure really difficult to take place on the continent. And also, like, you can see this taking place when you look at wages. The agriculture-industrial wage gap is really, really high, which is evidence that there's some kind of friction, right? That agriculture probably could have done better by enclosure, but they were worried about revolt. Now, so this system, you can imagine that it had its complications. It's hyper-local. There was lots of variation. And indeed, it probably could not have lasted forever. But the thing that really pushed it over the edge, the straw that broke the camel's back, was indeed the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the appearance of factories. Factories complicated the old poor law, because if you have a poor law that relies on a tax on land and buildings, and then factories come in and are producing a lot of value, the tax no longer captures the creation of wealth, right? Because in a factory, where wealth is coming from is the value added by the machines, not necessarily the land and the buildings. Furthermore, remember, factories are dangerous, awful, unpleasant places that may be creating poverty through disability, and they're meanwhile not paying a lot of the tax. So this creates an argument between the landlords and the factory owners, right? This is a major point of contention. And that argument heats up so much that the old poor law, eventually disappeared and gave way to the new poor law, which was instituted in 1834. Now, if you've read any Charles Dickens, this is the poor law that you know about. The arguments that we just discussed between agriculture and industry about the old poor law, and also concerns about weakening incentives of work and other debates, give rise to this reform. And its most major reform of the old poor law was the ending of outdoor relief. Now remember, if you were a poor person, you would have preferred to stay home and receive some kind of relief or wage top-up. Now all that's left is indoor relief. Some people think this was sort of the last hurrah for the landlords as they're being displaced by this new rising class of factory owners. This is a last effort to get some political power. And this law, meanwhile, it shows you a really dramatically changing attitude about the causes and consequences of poverty. This has a really different attitude about poor people than Elizabeth's statute had. Now remember, neither necessarily has a great view of the poor, right? Elizabeth's statute was about social control. The new poor law is about discipline, right? It's the idea that being poor is your fault. You're choosing to be lazy. You're choosing to not work. You could choose to do otherwise. So they're trying to send the message with this new poor law that, well, now here we are in 1834, being poor is a really bad idea for you. So this is a really different change in the philosophy of poverty. The centerpiece of this new poor law is, of course, indoor relief, which means workhouses. And again, these workhouses, these institutions, were unpleasant by design. They give you a place to stay, they give you clothes, they give you food, but they're not meant to be pleasant. They exist as punishment to say to you, look, being poor is unpleasant. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps or whatever and go find a job. A maybe less nefarious interpretation is that the workhouse is trying to solve that problem of giving relief only to folks who are truly poor. The reasoning is the following. Given how awful a workhouse is, given that basically all they do is keep you alive, you would do anything to avoid it. So if you can do anything to avoid the workhouse, you would. Okay, this is sort of like a kind of separating equilibrium in a game theory sense to show us who is really poor. That sounds, though, like an awful inconvenience and pain in the butt for folks who are really suffering from poverty. So you hear the same kind of debate over how to figure out who is really poor in modern welfare systems today. There's a really great This American Life all about provisions for the poor in the modern United States called Trends with Benefits. And I've posted that as an optional bit of media for this module. So take a look at it. It's really, really good. I wanted to show you a little bit of a visual of what this workhouse might have looked like. So this here is a painting or a print. And you can see like you've got all these people lined up in very close quarters. And they're all doing some menial task. Assembling... usually it's like maybe like assembling shirts, like the final stage of textile production. That was a pretty common task. And now here's another picture. There's something kind of unusual about this picture, which is that it's not a painting. This is a photograph. This is a 20th century workhouse in Ireland. And, you know, that's a whole history of conflict between the Irish and the English. It's really interesting to read about. Workhouses were phased out slowly, especially in places where those in authority had a particularly negative view of the poor.